Hey, Bill.
John, how are you?
I'm good, man. This is great. Here we are. Uh, I'm going to make you co-host here if I know how to do that. Okay.
Okay,
Is that all
yeah,
right
the
with you?
question is whether I know how to do anything with that.
Well, you don't have to. Well, actually, that might be something. When you see, like, if you're a co-host, you can mute me.
Right.
You can tell me, without my knowing it. You just make me silent, and that's a good thing. If somebody is,
And
I'll show you
can I
how in a
click on
second.
your, okay, all right. I was gonna say,
Okay, does it tell you anywhere that you are co-host? So go to participants on the bottom next to chat.
mhm.
Okay, and look on that. And
Co-host me, yeah.
yeah, okay. So then go to the top and, well, actually, yeah, you could go to the top and click on me and it'll say mute and you could mute me. Don't do it, but that's
Uh-huh,
one
yeah,
thing
okay,
if I go to the bathroom and someone starts talking or a baby is yelling, you can go to them
got it.
and mute them.
No,
Anyway, it's so much fun. Thanks for doing this. How you doing?
pretty good, yeah, just been away for the week, so just came back after mid.
So hello and welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this great program for the Beatitude Center of the Nonviolent Jesus with my friend Bill Wiley Kellerman. And today we're going to read and discuss some anti-war poetry from our friend Daniel Berrigan, which is from my recent collection of political anti-war poems by Dan, which you can see here, The Trouble with Our State. I hope you all get the book. First, let me ask everyone to make sure that you're muted and feel free to write any questions or comments in the chat box there at the bottom. And Bill and I will talk for 50 minutes, maybe longer, and then we'll open it up for 40 or 30 minutes. It'll be an hour and a half or maybe a little longer. And on Monday, which is Dan's birthday, we will send out the Zoom recording link if you'd like to listen to it again, or for those who missed it. So friends, let's begin with a little prayer. And I invite us, if you'd like, to take a deep breath and moment of silence and enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you. And let's ask for whatever blessings of peace we need for ourselves in our poor world. Beloved God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us, the whole human race. Be with us now as we reflect on the poetry of Daniel Berrigan, our friend, and inspire us, strengthen us, and guide us, that we might do our part to support the global grassroots movements to end war and poverty and racism and nuclear weapons and environmental destruction and all violence, that we too might be your holy people of peace, love, and nonviolence, true followers of the nonviolent Jesus, your beatitude people like Dan, holy peacemakers. In Jesus' name, amen. So, dear friends, again, welcome. It's such a difficult time as we say no to war in the Ukraine, no to the threat and existence of nuclear weapons, no to NATO and its militarism and war baiting, and no to the mammoth US military budget, no to all wars, the war on the poor, the war on children, the war on creatures, the war on Mother Earth. And I thought, as a way to encourage us to keep going forward in the life of peace and hope and nonviolence, as we honor for Dan's birthday, we could read some of Dan's poems. And so I called my friend Bill Kellerman, who may remember a year ago we shared a Zoom. And so I'm going to ask Bill to say a few things, and then we're going to take turns reading a poem and then reflecting on it, and then the other may respond to it. So I'll do a poem first, then Bill, then me, then Bill, and back and forth. We hope to go through 10 poems and then open it up for a conversation with everybody. And again, all the poems are from this collection, The Trouble with Our State, which came out last year, which you can get from Whitman Stock. Just so you know, the page numbers in the table of contents are wrong. Dan would love that, just to keep you on your toes. So let me introduce Bill to you officially. He's a longtime friend of Dan's and also William Stringfellow, the theologian. Bill's a pastor, theologian, activist, and lives with his family in Detroit, and is the author of several great books, but this great book of essays about Dan, which came out last year, called Celebrant's Flame, which if you don't have, I hope you'll get it. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Bill Wiley Kellerman. Welcome, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks not only for inviting me into the poetry conversation today, but into the project of the book. I really appreciated getting a chance to suggest some poems for it and write a foreword, which is directly connected to the Celebrant's Flame book. You know, when I was trying to get myself thinking about writing a foreword, I printed out stuff I'd written about Dan previously, and all of a sudden I said, maybe, I got something more here. And you set me on a path there where Celebrant's Flame just kind of poured out of me. So I'm appreciative in a lot of ways. Thanks.
So great. So we're just going to jump right in, okay, friends? And this first poem is the title poem. Again, hold on, I pressed the wrong button. It's the title poem of the book called The Trouble with Our State, and I like it, and it's a doozy, and it's page 1 if you have the book with you. And it's always been one of my favorites. It says, the trouble with our state is not civil disobedience, which is thousands of people protesting war and racism and the whole culture that's killing the planet and getting arrested and going to jail. Remember, at one point in Gandhi's campaign, he had 300,000 people in jail for nonviolent civil disobedience. Dan says the trouble with our state is civil obedience. So I'll read the poem. The trouble with our state was not civil disobedience, which in any case was hesitant and rare. Civil disobedience was rare as kidney stone, no rarer. It was disappearing like immigrants' disease. You've heard of a war on cancer? There is no war like the plague of media. There is no war like routine. There is no war like 3 square meals. There is no war like a prevailing wind. It blows softly, whispers, don't rock the boat. The sails obey, the ship of state rolls on. The trouble with our state, we learned it only afterward, when the dead resembled the living who resembled the dead, and civil virtue shone like paint on tin, and tin citizens and tin soldiers marched to the common whip. Our trouble, the trouble with our state of soul, with our state of siege, was civil obedience. Wow. So notice he's saying that the American culture is waging a war upon us, Americans, and that it's oppressing us and we don't even realize it in a certain way. The war of the media. He calls it the war of routine, the war of going about our daily business while the whole world is suffering and dying. And the message being, don't rock the boat. And I would say Dan thought we were slaves, stuck in this culture of violence and war and don't realize it. But the last line is that punch, and it's really helped me get mobilized to do a lot of civil disobedience, where he says, the trouble with our state is civil obedience. So I invite you to think about that and what we can do about it as we move deeper into fascism, tyranny, moving away from democracy, deeper into racism, greater inequality, permanent war making, closer to nuclear war, catastrophic climate change. I know Dan would have been thinking about that old phrase, we don't want to be good, obedient Germans. And he's talking about the 1920s and 30s of the poor people who did nothing. And then it was about resistance. And then it was too late when the Nazis were taking over and killing everybody. So I hear this poem as a call to resistance. And I like that. In other words, he's saying, do what you can for our common liberation from this whole sick system of permanent war, racism, greed, and nuclear weapons, and so forth, and keep at it, do what you can. And even engaging in civil disobedience. In other words, keep on rocking the boat. Bill, if you want to add a thought.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess the one thing I would add is the notion, you wouldn't think of Dan to say our state. He was, because he saw it as a principality invading us. But he's got kind of a double meaning going on here, where it's our state, the principality, with the power of death, but also the trouble with the state of mind, state of heart, state of soul, state of conscience. You know, it's inside too. And if we're going to address and transform the state out there, I think we got to start close to home, he's saying.
That's great. Thank you. Lead on.
Yeah, I wanted to read one that's on page 18. I think that's the correct page. Tulips in the prison yard, which we had in our community in Battle Creek. A portion of it was on a poster and it was on our wall. So I actually memorized a portion of it. Well, I think I'll go ahead and read the whole thing. This is from Dan Barry, from the Prison Poems. All kinds of poets, believe me, could better praise you. Sovereign beauty, your altogether subtle translation of blank nature. So that winds, night, sunlight, extraordinarily colorless phenomenon are drawn into what can only be called a new game. Well, I will not revel in humiliation. Yeats, Wordsworth would have looked once, breathed deep, gone home, sharpened quills, and with a flourish plucked you from time. But you are jail yard blooms. You wear bravery with a difference. You are born here, will die here, making you by excess of suffering and transfiguration of suffering ours. I see prisoners pass in dead spur of spring before you show face. Are you their glancing tears, the faces of wives and children, the yin yang of hearts, to fro like hanged necks, and perpetual cruelty, absurdity? The prisoners pass and pass, shades of men, pre-men, khaki ghosts, shame, futility, between smiles, between reasons for smiles, between life as fool's pace and life as celebrant's flame, eons. Yet, thank you against the whips of ignorant furies, the slavish pieties of Judas priests, you stand the first flicker in the brain's soil, a precursor of judgment. Dawn might be, we may be, or spelling it out in the hand's palm of a blind mute. God is fire, is love. I think of, he names Wordsworth and even Yeats here. There's a kind of humility that he's beginning with in a way, but also he's up to a different project than they. He doesn't want to pluck them from the flowers from time and turn them into eternity. They have a really concrete location as far as Dan is concerned. And I think of them as probably surprising him, being a bulb underground, bursting forth when the time is right, and not knowing it was there hidden, waiting to come out. And this notion of being born here, die here, there are prisoners who are sentenced to life without parole, as well as those who are sentenced to death. Both are, death sentences in a way, and yet he's talking about something that in the midst of it is going to keep coming up. I think kind of a very conscious, almost resurrection image here. I'm sure you heard Celebrant's Flame there. That's the title of the book that John mentioned, and I took it from this poem. Between life is fool's pace, and you think of prisoners pacing the yard or the cell there. And then maybe just this last reference, I think is about the poet's struggle, spelling it out in the palm's hand of a blind mute, trying to communicate what can't be seen or heard, which is actually God being fire and love. That's that's a task of communication that maybe only poetry can carry on.
That's just beautiful, Bill. I was, tulips in the prison yard. Wow. And being in prison, as John Bach could tell us, and just walking around, that's all you got. But he's noticing and writing a poem about them. And at the end, he says, thank you. And I was thinking that they're witnesses to Dan and the prisoners, that dawn, there might be a new dawn, that humanity is the word I have in my translation, might one day become human. And then that incredible line, as you said, spelling it out in the hand's palm of a blind mute, that God is fire, God is love. That the tulips are telling Dan that and telling us that. It's just beautiful image. So thanks, Bill. I'm going to move on to another favorite of mine, which is the second book, the second poem in the book, called Prophecy. And it's a doozy also. So I'm going to read it. It's on page 2 if you got the book. Here goes. The way I see the world is strictly illegal. To it, through my eyes, is illegal. Yes, to it. I live like a pickpocket, like the sun, like the hand that writes this by my wits. This is not permitted, that I look on the world, and worse, insist that I see what I see. A conundrum, a fury, a burning bush, and with 5 fingers where my eyes fail, trace with a blackened brush on butcher sheets, black on white, black for blood, white for death, where the light fails. That face, which is not my own, and my own. That death, which is not my own, and my own. This is strictly illegal and will land me in trouble, as somewhere now in a precinct, in a dock, the statutes thrash in fury. Hear them, hear ye the majestic jaws of crocodiles in black shrouds, the laws forbidding me the world, the truth, under blood oath, forbidding row upon row of razors, of statutes, of molars, of grinders, those bloodshot eyes, legal, sleepless, man-eating, not letting me not let blood. Wow. I remember, I heard Dan read's his poems probably hundreds of times, actually, because then every time we gathered for dinner for 10 years, poems were read first. And, but I remember the first time Dan read this publicly was at a party in his honor at our friend Ramsey Clark's office. Ramsey Clark, the former attorney general, who was our lawyer. And he stood up and read it kind of like I just did and sat down, and we all went, oh my God. And I think, Bill, it's about the prophetic vocation, the duty and calling to speak the truth of peace and nonviolence publicly, which means to say no to war and nuclear weapons and all destruction and violence, and to say yes to life and peace and justice and love. In other words, to do everything you can publicly to stop the killing. But I really love the first line, which you can take in so many ways. The way I see the world is strictly illegal. I think that's very clever and interesting. Everything happening in the world right now, as far as God is concerned, is illegal, according to God's law. Everything happening in the world right now, as far as the world is concerned, is perfectly, totally legal. It's legal to bomb and kill people. To prepare for nuclear war is legal. Warfare, racism, poverty, hunger, corporate greed, bringing down democracy, gun violence, executions, nuclear weapons, the destruction of the creatures, catastrophic climate change, not stopping the fossil fuel thing, all that's totally legal. So he sees it as illegal. And he's saying that this visionary way of life, which I call nonviolence, is illegal. It's illegal in a world of permanent war and violence to be a person who sees the way of peace, the possibilities of peace, even the God of peace. It's not permitted to see the possibilities of a new nonviolent world and then to go and say what you see. And that's the prophetic vocation. We say what we see, even though it's illegal to say it or to see it. And if you do, he says, it's going to land you in trouble in a world of violence and war on the brink, as we are. Ukraine just being one latest example of it. It's going to land you under arrest and rejection. And then that whole last section about judges. Chaz, I wonder what you think about this, but I'm thinking about all the judges I've been before. You know, he calls them crocodiles in black shrouds. I mean, I know what he means. And that last line, not letting me not let blood. It's so poetic. And they're not letting me trying to stop the killing. So I hear the call I hear the poem as a call to pursue our own prophetic vocations. Nobody talks about that anymore, except for Dan and probably Stringfellow. That each of us have to speak publicly the truth of peace and nonviolence and do what we can, regardless of the consequences so we try to stop the killing and they stop us from trying to stop that. It reminds me, Bill, of one of my favorite poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay, which begins, I shall die, but that is all I shall do for death. Bill?
Yeah, just quick, one of the things I noticed in working on this whole series that you pulled together was the first time I noticed how often Dan uses double negatives, like here at the end, not letting me not let blood, what you point out. And the poem begins with, is illegal, yes. It's yes, saying yes is illegal. yes to life. But in some ways, what we've got for saying yes is saying no to no, saying no to the big no of death. And So anyway, I feel that sort of that movement in this poem.
Mm. Well, go on, Bill. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. One of the poems I had suggested for the book is a long poem, and John said I could, because it's so long, he said I could take a couple extra minutes talking about it. We can't do the whole thing, but it appears on page 32 to 37. And
Mm.
It's not been published in a book before, even in the collection the kind of definitive collection that John pulled together. It was published by the Thomas Merton Center and in New York at St. John the Divine, and they published it as a series of posters with art by Tom Lewis. If I were technologically adept, I'd be screen sharing, but the posters all fit together, and the collage art of Tom, who was a Catholic worker artist, Worcester, Mass, and was part of the Baltimore Four, the very first draft board action, and then again with the Dan with the Catonsville Nine. Anyway, the poem is long. At one point, I memorized the whole thing, sitting in a tiger cage that we had at the back of the chapel at Union Seminary, but also in another one that was on the steps of the U.S. Capitol as a demonstration. So anyway, I'm just going to recite the first section of it. Dear friends, your faces are a constriction of grief in the throat. Your words weigh us like chains. Your tears and blood fall on our faces. Prison, Vietnam, prison, US. Prison is our fate. Mothers bear us in prison. Our tongues taste its gall. Bars spring up from dragon's teeth, impaling us. A universal, malevolent will crouched like a demon, blows winter upon us, stiffens our limbs in death, the limbs of women and children. Here, they hawk death in the streets, death in the Hamburg joint, death in the hardware, death in the cobbler's hammer, death in the jeweler's glass, the classy showrooms of death. Death, shouts the newsboy. Death, oranges, lemons, death in a candy wrapper. The cinema blares it, death, but out of sight and mind, like an aquarium at midnight, like the eyes of a captive tiger, a colony of golden eyes of bees in their cells, a miser's mine of jewels throttling the moon underground, you and I. Our eyes like grapes beneath the nailed boot, our why dragged in the dust, a flayed animal's intro, our how long is the lifeline thrown from God to Job. I'm kind of assuming that the poem was passed to the Vietnamese prisoners, many of whom were in tiger cages, through Thich Nhat Hanh in Paris. I'm struck by that section in this first stanza about death, and all the ways that he just hints at that, gives a glimpse. Death in the Hamburg joint. And, it's almost like doing social analysis in poetry. If you think about, the clearing of the Amazon forest to grow beef, or the immigrant folks, undocumented often in the slaughterhouses, how death is under everything, and these things in particular, the cinema, the jeweler's glass, the diamonds, it's underneath it, killing literally and violence. And then he comes to death with a capital D. Stringfellow speaks of the power of death, and he names it a living moral reality. And in some ways, it's almost it's his way of speaking about what the scriptures do in terms of Satan. And then this question, how long? That's the question that the martyrs in the book of Revelation under the altar are asking. How long, will this go on? And this image of long as the lifeline thrown from God to Job is, I thought so often of that. It's actually an apocalyptic image. And I guess I would want to say, speak to questions, the why, the how long, even though they're excruciating, they're actually forms of faith. A question to God is a confession of faith, in a way. I'll say one more thing. In a later stanza, he talks specifically about Catonsville, and you listen for, just in what I'll recite, just listen for Christmas, listen for Dan's back pain, and the cost of paying up. So he says, if the birth of a child is sufficient reason to trim the lamps of the universe, to wreathe in smiles our stiff-jointed discontent, then it must be held with equally rigorous logic that the murder of a child is sufficient reason to burn like trash or offal those hunting licenses which go by the civilized euphemism draft files, to endure imprisonment, loss of repute, the stigma of Cain burned by the perfumed hands of judges, politicos, and churchmen on the forehead of Abel. That, I think, it anticipates the next poem that John is going to read. And I'll only add that the last line of the poem, which was not the original last line, but came from another poem, The Risen Tin Can. It ends, it is snowing tonight as I vigil, the first white fall of winter, bitterly cold. I think on the fevers and horrors of Kansan. No to their no, yes to all else. There's the double negative again, and held together with the yes. Anyway, thanks for a little extended space there, John.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just commend people to take their time with it and read the whole thing.
Thank you. I'm so touched that you memorized part of that. Folks, I hope this is okay for you all, that you're doing okay listening to all these heavy poems. But Bill, when I'm hearing you speak and reading myself, I'm reminded, the community that Dan and I were part of in the Upper West Side, we went off for a week together once a year and 2 weekends together twice a year. And I went with them for 25 years. And we took turns doing exactly what we're doing now, Bill, usually reading really heavy duty poems. And it would take you, these were all Jesuits, our friends. And this was our retreat, usually Hopkins. It would take you to a deep level a deeper place that nothing else can do. Rhetoric can't do it. Political commentary or writing can't. This poem I didn't know about until Bill sent it to me. And you know that line about the capital D, I heard Dan speak about that 50 times. That's from Auden, his famous poem, September 1st, 1939, marking the beginning of the US entry into World War I, where he speaks of death, but he has it with a capital D throughout. And I heard Dan say, so it's not that we're up against Putin or Trump or Biden or Bush or Reagan. And it's no longer that we're up against the principalities and powers. This is what Dan said, Bill. What we're up against is death and the means and metaphors of death. Everything is death, death, death. And he got that from Auden. And here it is in this incredible poem, folks. You got to read it. And the next one, which we didn't have time to read, There Isn't Tin Can. The other thing is, I'm glad you brought up Thich Nhat Hanh, my great friend and Dan's great friend, because Dan writes throughout, there's a whole section there about Lord Buddha and Lord Christ, Lord Buddha, Lord Christ. And remember, folks, the poem is an open letter from representing the prisoners in the United States who were resisting the Vietnam War to the prisoners in Vietnam. It's so touching, you know, this poem that Bill's reading. But they had conversations about that. And then later, eventually, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote the book, Living Buddha, Living Christ. And I think he got all that from Dan. And then, you know, there's so much more to talk about that poem. But the last line is so quintessential Dan. To say no to their no, and yes to all else. No, as Bill said, and Dan said this all his life. No to their not letting us not kill. No to their not letting us say no to war. And yes to life, yes to peace and love. It's a great, simple way to think about it. So I'm going to read another poem now called Payment. If you've got the book, it might be on page 107. Yeah. So, this poem is about one of the most difficult civil disobedience experiences I ever experienced, and I'm sure Dan too. So I'm going to tell you the story about the poem. Is when we were arrested in January 2000 on Dr. King's birthday in New York City, and then I'll read the poem. Dan and I and a few friends, we did this every couple of months. We went to the USS Intrepid, which is the old battleship docked on the Hudson River along the west side of Manhattan, which they turned into this big museum. You can see it today. There's a battleship there right near Times Square. And it has on it every kind of bomb and weapon the United States has ever made. And they've made, since it opened in 1984, we protested the opening. Every public school in the whole New York area brings buses of children every day on field trips to learn about the wonders of war and the United States. So we would go there every couple of months and we'd hold up banners being against war. And then after a while, we would walk up to the entrance, kneel down, block the entrance and get arrested. And the whole time, 1,000 kids would be watching this. We did this for years and years. And this particular day was really cold. It was January, and we weren't thinking of Dr. King. And we were arrested at 11 a.m. and they handcuff you. And they put, you know, men and women into separate small metal vans with a big metal thing in the middle of it. And we were driven. So we're crowded into this thing and we're driven to the Midtown precinct to be booked, which is a place we all knew very well, expecting to be released in a few hours. And then we'd go out for food to recover. Well, that day, the jail was full. So we sat in the van freezing for several hours. Finally, they drove us to the East Side, to their booking. and that was full too. So after a couple hours, we were driven to Harlem, but that was full too. And the whole time we're in metal handcuffs behind our backs. We're sliding around this metal van and we're freezing. We hadn't been expected to be outside in the weather that long. And this went on till midnight. And they finally brought us to the Tombs, which they never did for us protesters. And that's in Lower Manhattan, 5 stories below the city courthouse, which is the main jail for the hundreds and hundreds of people who are arrested every day. And they parked our little van 6 blocks from the Tombs. And you know, a New York City block is really long, and it's midnight and it's freezing. So they get us off the back of the metal van and they chain us together in the chain gang. We have chains on our ankles, our waists, and our wrists. We're chained together, single file, with armed guards on each side of each one of us. And we start walking. And it took, I thought it was like 45 minutes to go the 6 blocks. And it was below freezing, really, really cold. And once we got inside the jail cell, it was so crowded with hundreds and hundreds of men that no one could sit down. So we were all standing together, squeezed together, all through the night and all through the next day until 5 o'clock, when our names were finally called and we were brought before a judge. It was totally awful. And as I was in the chain gang, I was chained right behind Dan. And he only had a little tiny thin windbreaker. And I was shaking. It was so cold. So I'm walking behind him at 12:30 in the morning and looking at him in his chains, freezing. And it felt like Good Friday. Just took me to a deep place of following the nonviolent Jesus as he carried the cross of resistance. And it helped me to learn or think about the price Jesus paid for speaking out and taking action. So here's the poem. It's called Payment, and it's on page 107. It was something akin to paying your way. No saving metaphor, to be sure. Paying for the next smile, the next heartbeat, the next sunset. Something owed life. The sheer beauty, yes, the heartbreak. Some small price, all said, handcuffed, driven in a chain gang across Manhattan at cold midnight. Something paid to strike the manacles Christ bore and bears in the world. Does the metaphor befit? I'm unsure. That way it might. So I read that because it brought back that story and this theme of resistance. But it's the title is a very big theme for Dan, Payment. It's maybe his most famous quote about, the cost of peacemaking is at least as costly as war making. Discipleship to Jesus is not free, it's costly. And sooner or later in this world, you have to pay up. And I used to hear him say off the cuff, like sometimes as an aside, I like to pay as I go. And instead of having to pay when I die, you see the difference. So he's asking us, what price are you willing to pay for peace? Bill?
Yeah, just the story and wanting to add into it what we know about Dan's chronic back pain from arthritis or congenitally, that whole story, and add in his back into it, standing all day or all that time, I think of. You also made me think of the tombs. I was in the old tombs before they were destroyed in '74 and torn down. And that was an action that John Bach, who's going to come up next, helped lead me into. And The one thing I did want to say is the question of the metaphor, which is related to payment. I think the metaphor he's talking about, no saving metaphor, is redemption. You know, it's the metaphor that St. Paul uses to try to understand the cross, so just from one angle, you know, as redeeming land, paying to redeem land, redeem a slave, redeem. There's freedom involved in paying up, and I think that's the metaphor that he's asking. Of course, you can, if you turn it into you know, like this is the whole thing, it ends up being a pretty deadly understanding of the atonement. But as an aspect of what's being talked about, and I think it's really helpful as you've pointed out. And this idea of does the metaphor befit? I'm not sure, he says. That way it might. And this notion of not being sure made me think of Gandhi, you know, who embraced nonviolence as a sort of an absolute essential of truth and humanity. But he also spoke of being committed to nonviolence because he was not so sure of the truth that he was willing to kill for it, which is really backdoor understanding of sort of building nonviolence on a kind of modesty before the truth. Anyway,
well, that's lovely.
I'm
lovely.
saying,
Thank you.
saying too much. I did want to introduce John Bach, who happens to be on. He was at Danbury. He was a draft resistor and was at Danbury with Dan Berrigan. And I had decided to do Psalm 126 from his book, Uncommon Prayer, which I happen to know John knows by heart. So I asked if he would read it, or as it were, recite it.
Well, first, John Deere, thank you so much for organizing such a rich and profound gathering. Bill Wildey-Kellerman, my admiration and love for you continues to grow and grow. And Art Laffin, oh brother, it is good to see you, and thank you for your life. As Bill said, Dan took it upon himself to retell a number of the Psalms in the book of Uncommon Prayer. There's a seeming contradiction in the theme of Psalm 126, which is liberation in captivity. I was one of those khaki ghosts circling the compound and know what it is to leave ghosthood behind and to become a full-bodied, full-blooded, full-spirited human being. Dan wrote, "When the Spirit struck us free, we could scarce believe it for very joy. Were we free? Were we wrapped in a dream of freedom, our mouths filled with laughter, our tongues with pure joy? The oppressors were awestruck. What marvels this Spirit works for them. Like a torrent in flood, our people streamed out, locks, bars, cages, gulags, ghettos, a nightmare scattered. We trod those long furrows, slaves, sowing in tears. A lightning bolt loosed us, and now we tread those same furrows, half drunk with joy, the golden sheaves in our arms." Dan put a lot of golden sheaves in our arms. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, John.
Yeah, just quick, John. Dan did this book of poems, Uncommon Prayer, which are him riffing on particular psalms. This on 126. And Psalm 126 is a psalm of captivity. It's a psalm that's set in Babylonian captivity. and yearning for freedom. Prisoners, yeah, a lot of times you'll see prisoners with calendars on the wall and X's marking off dates, and they're all headed toward the out date, which is the day of freedom, right? That you kind of keep before you as a way to endure, what you're going through. And Dan, in this poem, and there's also a little reflection that goes with it. So if you get the Uncommon Prayer book, you'll have his commentary where he talks about praying it on behalf of prisoners who will never see the out date. And he's thinking about folks all around the world, and he names places, but also prisoners, whose sentences are open-ended, prisoners who are sentenced to die in prison in one way or another, and to pray it on their behalf, which is how the Psalms work. It's a psalm that's in a concrete moment, uttered and prayed, but then it becomes accessible, sort of more, not exactly universally, but in many sort of wider ways. I wanted to show also the artwork that goes with it. This is by Robert McGovern, and is another instance of Dan's collaboration with visual artists, which he really often did, either working from the art, which is not the case here, but where McGovern is taking Dan's poem and doing this image of a prisoner stepping into freedom. And I would say underneath it is the feel of resurrection. And in many ways, biblically, in terms of the Hebrew Bible, the freedom from captivity is a seed of resurrection theme in the scriptures generally. So I'll stop there. Thanks again, John and John.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. It's lovely. So moving on to a couple more, if you can stand it, you all. This is the last poem in the book. It's called Zen Poem, and it's the conversation between a young novice monk and the older, wiser Zen monk. And the young fellow is saying, "I wish I had supernatural powers." And the old guy is saying, "What? Just try to use your natural powers." So it's a big theme of Dan's. Here goes. "How I long for supernatural powers," said the novice mournfully to the Holy One. "I see a dead child and I long to say, 'Arise.' I see a sick man, I long to say, 'Be healed.' I see a bent old woman, I long to say, 'Walk straight.' Alas, I feel like a stick in paradise. Master, can you confer on me supernatural powers?" The old man shook his head fretfully. "How long have I been with you and you know nothing? How long have you known me and learned nothing? Listen, I have walked the earth for 80 years. I have never raised a dead child. I have never healed a sick man. I have never straightened an old woman's spine. Children die, men grow sick, the aged fall under a stigma of frost. And what is that to you or me but a turn of the wheel, but the way of the world, but the gateway to paradise? Supernatural powers. Then you would play God, would spin the thread of life and measure the thread 5 years, 50 years, 80 years, and cut the thread? Supernatural powers. I have wandered the earth for 80 years, I confess to you, sprout without root, root without flower. I know nothing of supernatural powers. I have yet to perfect my natural powers. to see and not be seduced, to hear and not be deafened, to taste, not be eaten, to touch and not be bought. But you, would you walk on water? Would you master the air? Would you swallow fire? Go and talk with the dolphins. They will teach you glibly how to grow gills. Go listen to eagles. They will hatch you, nest you, eaglet and airman. Go join the circus. Those tricksters will train you in deception for dimes. Birdman, bagman, poor fish, sprouting fire, moon crawling at sea forever. Supernatural powers. Do you seek miracles? Listen. Go. Draw water. Hew wood, break stones, how miraculous. Listen, blessed is the one who walks the earth 5 years, 50 years, 80 years, and deceives no one, curses no one, kills no one. On such a one, the angels whisper in wonder, behold the irresistible power of natural powers, of height, of joy, of soul, of non-belittling. You dry stick in the crude soil of this world, spring, root, leaf, flower, trace, around and around and around, an inch, a mile, the world's green extent, a liberated zone of paradise. I love that because to me, it speaks to Dan's great theme, which is his initial conversation he had with Thomas Merton on the day they met in 1962. What does it mean to be a human being? And Dan said, we humans want to play God, whereas God wants to be human and came to us to show us how to be human. So we killed him and we end up becoming inhuman, and our inhumanity is destroying us. And Merton and he said that none of us are fully human yet. We're still infected by the culture's inhumanity. Part of us is still inhuman toward ourselves and others and supports the world's inhumanity. So instead of wanting to be human, we want to dominate others, control others, be powerful, be little emperors. That's what he means by supernatural powers. But the invitation is to be human with one another, which is what I think the poem is saying. Be kind, gentle, loving, ordinary, and nonviolent to ourselves and one another, and work for a more nonviolent world. And isn't that miraculous to be human? And if we tried to be human, we'd end war and injustice and violence. So the spiritual life really is not trying to become God, but to become human. And notice the beatitude he wrote at the end. Blessed is the one who deceives no one, curses no one, kills no one. On this one, the angels will be in awe of the irresistible power of natural powers. I love that. Bill, any comment? Otherwise, you can move on because we're coming to the end.
I have not a single word to add to Zen poem.
Okay, well, we each have one left, I think, right?
Yeah. I wanted to read the Block Island Cottage poem, which is on 93. You've got the book, and John has a little introduction to it about it being on the wall of Dan's cottage on the bluff overlooking the Atlantic. And there was a point where I also knew this one by heart. It's short, but I'm not going to try it. I'm just going to read it. Where this house dares stand at land's end, when the sea turns in sleep, ponderous, menacing, and our spirit fails and runs landward, seaward, a skelter. We pray you protect from the law's clawed outreach, from the second death, from envy's tooth, from doom's great knell, all who dwell here. I once described it as an exorcism poem, but it's really not. There's nothing. It's not. casting out. Stringfellow did do an exorcism of his house after Anthony's death to scatter death and its presence from the house. But this is more, if it's a riff on a psalm, it's Psalm 91 that the monks chant at Compline. It's their "Now I lay me down to sleep" psalm, which says, the arrow that flies by day, you it will never approach, the pestilence that runs at noon. It's all this list of things that the terrors of the night that the psalm declares, if not praise, protection from. And this psalm or this poem certainly names the powers, the law, the state, an empire. The laws Claude reach, you have to think of Dan's own arrest on the island where at the end of his 4 or 5 months underground, where the reach of the law did catch up with him and the FBI posing as bird watchers. And he envisions, as Stringfellow's house was for him at the time, he envisions the cottage as a safe house, which was also what he experienced in a whole series of underground visitations. He names the second death, which is a reference to the Book of Revelation, and I forget. I'm gonna guess chapter 18. That's a little bit of a wild guess, but where the book speaks of those who suffer the second death. And if you want to read about Dan's in his commentary on Revelation, The Nightmare of God, he's got a sort of an anthology of terms at the beginning, and he has a couple pages on the second death. So if you want to read that. Envy's Tooth is obviously greed. And there were two versions of the poem. The first one, this is on the wall of the cottage, in his sort of unique calligraphy, unique and recognizable. The first version had a list of people at the bottom, mostly resistors, folks who had, he'd given hospitality and access to the cottage to recover from prison or some ordeal. And I remember, coveting being on that on that list. I was not there, but there were recognizable names that were on it. And then the cottage was, at a certain point, was improved. It was insulated and a new wood stove put in, and in the course of that, the poem was destroyed, and he had to do it again. And in the closet, you can see him trying out the magic marker on the inside of the closet wall just to see how it's going to look. And his calligraphy, he combines capital letters and lowercase letters in a really distinctive way. Anyway, the second version, instead of the names, at the bottom it has a cross, a simple cross, and a wolf's head, like a black, I think it was metal, may have been wood, but a wolf's head that was mounted there. And I think that's actually really important to mention. On the one hand, he begins his autobiography, To Dwell in Peace, with a description uh, his older brother in Minnesota, where they lived, close to Lake Superior. And one time in a cold winter, his older brother had taken him out on a walk on his shoulders and then into a woodshed and thrust his face into the open mouth of a wolf that had been killed and was hung in the woodshed as a frozen body. But he said he screamed and screamed. The child screamed and screamed. And so, in a certain sense, it's the wolf's head on the foot of the poem names his sort of deep-seated existential fears from which he's yearning and calling for protection. And maybe it invokes the story of Francis and the taming of the wolf and all of that as well. But anyway,
Good.
safe house poem. I'm going to shut
Thank
up.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thank you, Bill. So we have 2 poems left, but we've gone an hour. So I'm thinking we ought to open it up now. And if there's not, we can hear from a few people. But Bill and I each have one other poem. I certainly want to share mine, and if we have time. But does that sound like okay, Bill? Plan?
Yeah, that's good. Good.
Yeah.
Sorry if I
So
got
we're great. And thanks everybody for your patience and listening. I hope this has been helpful. Let's just take a moment and see if you have a question or a comment, or thank you. Was it Liza? I don't know how to say your name, for suggesting. If you want to just say a word or a phrase that you liked, that touched you in some of the things you've heard. So maybe you can raise your hand and I'll try to call on you, get my attention, or write in the chat room. But if you raise your hand, that'll probably really get my attention. Otherwise, Bill and I will keep talking.
Yeah.
So jump in here.
Yeah, Natalie Goldberg, the writer, has a technique.
So who's speaking? I don't know who's speaking.
It's Lisa Apper.
Lisa. Okay, Lisa.
And I was saying Natalie Goldberg has a technique for writers. When we gather, it's called say back. And when you hear a poem or a piece of writing, everybody just takes it in, and then they say a word or a phrase that touched them. And sometimes it's repeated, and that's for the edification of the community at large, because we may all hold on to that one word or that one phrase. And sometimes it's different. And you don't say anything, you just say those words and nobody comments, and you just take it in until the sharing stops. And yeah.
Thank you, Liza. Somebody else want to make a comment? John, Yusenchek, go ahead and unmute yourself if you can.
I did that. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate this. I feeling really grateful because I'm thinking about that question, what does it mean to be a human? And I've been teaching mental health, clinical mental health counseling for 35 years. And I begin each class, every class I've ever taught, I begin with that question. And it came from a dinner I had with Dan when myself and a friend were in the apartment on 98th Street one night, and we were doing poetry. He had made dinner, and the sun was going down, and it got darker and darker and darker, and we're sitting in pitch black, finally just talking and chatting about this question of what it means to be a human. And that really stuck with me all these years, and I'm really grateful for that. So that last poem especially was really powerful. So thanks, guys.
Good. Thank you, John. Another comment or two. Art, you want to jump in? You can unmute yourself.
Well, a big hug and an embrace to you, Brother John, and John Bach and Bill Wiley Kellerman and others here. I don't know, but what a great remembrance of Dan that we're doing. I just wanted to thank you, John, for this treasure trove of poems that you put together. Who's to keep Dan's memory alive? And Bill, your great book, The Sullivan's Flame. I mean, So this is such a great gift as we remember Dan's going home to God and his birthday coming up on Monday. I'll be at the Pentagon on Monday for our weekly vigil, and we have a cardboard cutout of Dan that we did right after Dan died for our Feast of the Holy Innocents action, where we had these cutout figures of Dan with us. And Dan was arrested. Dan was arrested at the Pentagon many times, right? But in this case, when people were arrested, the cardboard cutouts of Dan were taken into custody, and they've never been returned. And so we could say that, Dan is still in custody there at the Pentagon. I think of it often when I'm vigiling there, at this center of war making on the planet. And I just, am so grateful of how all of us are really trying to keep Dan's spirit alive and his memory and all that he taught us and gave to us and nurtured us. And for those of you who don't know, there's a great article by John Bach in this book, Swords and the Plowshares, which was published way back in 1987. And when John was reading or giving his psalm about Dan, that Dan wrote, the background is in this book, Liberation and Captivity by John Bach, which I left in Danbury prison. I was given a job at the library. And so as my parting gift, when I was doing my time there for the Thames River Plowshares action, I gave the book to the librarian. And then I would go back and tell my friends who I was not going to see again, I said, go and please read this chapter, Liberation and Captivity. It's not in the prison manual. And you'll find out about the history of resistors who were here in 1972. And so anyway, what a great thing that John did, in writing that. But it's illuminated in the poem that you read, Tulip in the Prison Yard, Bill. So thank you. And then just
thank you, Art.
Just lastly,
Thank you.
We bring into our circle Brother Carl Cabot, who I don't know if you all know. He's in hospice care at the Oblate house in San Antonio, Texas. And I've had some FaceTime with him. He can't speak, he can sometimes open his eyes and he can hear things. He's still eating and everything, but this brother did 17 years in prison, for his plowshares and anti-war resistance. Some of us know him very well. And I
Thank
just
you.
want to bring him into our circle because he would be
Okay.
with us if he could.
Thanks
you.
so much, Art. I see we have a comment from Brother Thomas. Do you want to unmute yourself, Brother Thomas, and share a little more about what you said? And it's okay if you don't or can't.
Yeah. I forgot whether it was you, John, or Bill that made the quote about that there are so many people that want to be or pretend to be God, and yet God's self chose to become human, to take on our life. And that really left an impact on me, thinking about this, that who are we, or who am I, to think that I'm, that I have any power over anybody else. I mean, I've got to walk in humility, because God chose to walk in humility, to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, begging the group's permission, then, I'd like to do my last poem. We could hear another comment or two, and then Bill will do his last poem, and we might go a little bit longer, but if you're up for it, if that's okay with everybody. So is that all right, Bill?
Yeah.
So the last one It's meant a lot to me because this is a poem that Dan wrote. It's basically, in my opinion, it's for all of us who are working for peace and justice, and it addresses Merton's famous comment to Jim Forrest, "Do not depend on the hope of results." And the poem is found in this small book called Homage. I don't know if you can all see this, and I'm playing here. Yeah, Homage. So I put it's a tribute to Jared Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet. And almost every great Jesuit I know used to memorize Hopkins, which I had to do too. And you'd go to dinner with Dan, and there's food is sitting there, and he'd recite some long Jared Manley Hopkins poem. And we'd go, wow, it was also amazing. So he wrote this poem in honor of Hopkins. And the one I liked, I put in the collection here. So this background of why I like this and why I'm hoping to end with this, and Bill will also end with one, is that I'm hoping it gives us a little hope or a little way forward, at least that in the bad time of the world we're facing. It was the fall of 1993. Dan and I were leading a little retreat for college students at Virginia Tech up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that evening when he arrived, he gave me this copy, the first copy of Homage to Jared Manley Hopkins, as a gift. And it was real late, and we called it a night, and everybody went to their bed, but I was too excited and couldn't sleep. So I stayed up and I read his book all night. And the next morning before we started the session, Dan said, how did you sleep? And I said, I couldn't sleep at all. I just couldn't sleep. So I read your book, Homage. And he put his fork down, and I think he was upset at that. And he looked at me and he said, "That book took me 2 years to write, and you read it like in an hour or two before you went to sleep." And I don't know what came over me, but I responded by saying a line from the poem. "It would be better in bitter meantime to smile and lift a glass, the outcome in better hands than ours." And Dan smiled and said, "Touche." So here's the poem, page 92. "Taking stock of such as myself, and enduring as I must the dark quandary named here, named now, until a knell sound and the sea gives up its dead and continents heave like a pummeled doe, with exile's revenant and eternity's throat like a bell take note. All is well. It would be better in bitter meantime to smile and lift a glass, the starts and stops, brisk, becalmed, distempered, sweet, the sojourn short or long, the outcome in better hands than ours." I love that poem. It encourages me all these years to keep going and keep working for justice and peace, to do what we can to speak out and not to give into despair, which is exactly what the culture wants, not to give up, not to say there's no hope, which a lot of people are feeling now, but to trust in the God of peace and to make a toast to one another, as Dan liked to do, because the outcome's in better hands than ours. Everything is okay. We're all in God's hands. And anyway, that's a classic Dan teaching for me. Let me just see if anybody else has a quick response to that, and then I'll turn it over to Bill, either to that poem or anything else. I'm mindful of the time here too. Maybe raise your hand if you want to get my attention here. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Bill. Okay, Bill, you're up.
I like that poem a lot. I actually didn't. I have the book. I have a Hopkins book, but I wouldn't have placed it there. I'm really glad to have that. The last line makes me think of Gandhi's commitment that he insisted the Satyagrahi have, and that was non-attachment to results, which is a little bit like saying, everything is, let everything be an act of worship, trust it to God. And so anyway, I like your read of it. I wanted to end, or I don't know if we're ending, but my last
Yeah, we're
offering anyway
ending.
is a poem called Resurrection. It's on 114. And I have a personal connection with it because my wife, Jeannie, who died in 2005, and after a 7-year or 7.5 year struggle with an aggressive brain tumor. And it was clear at the time in November of 2005 that this was the home stretch, and so we quit all treatments and took the port out, and we also decided it was her 49th birthday, and so we decided to do a Jubilee birthday party for her. There were lots of folks who came to the party knowing they were sort of choosing between the Jubilee event and her funeral. It was a little bit like her being able to look in on the funeral, on her own funeral. Anyway, this is the poem that Dan sent for Jeannie's Jubilee party, 11/12/05. To raise the huge question, heave it like a boulder, far from the mouth, from the cave mouth, closed like a dossier, guilty and done with. A question, and there stands, alas, in death's arrogant dominion, only a hint, a meager dawn illumination. I circle the tomb warily. The Magdalene saw a gardener. John, Peter ran head to head. Crucifixion, shame, sets friends fleeing. Resurrection, and we crowd the rent tomb, fear and awe contending. I wish, wishing would bring you into being, my being, you who are like the lorn father of a demon-ridden child. I believe, help thou my unbelief. Or Graham Greene, this saves me. I don't believe my disbelief. Through the walls, you slip in or away like an airstream through air. That smile so seldom before. I don't think I actually have a lot to say about the poem. There's another double negative. I don't believe my disbelief. And I would say, John says this as well, that Dan really lived by an ethic of resurrection, that he lived and called on folks in community to live in freedom from the fear of death, freedom from the power of death. Stringfellow's lines as well, and that Dan had this ethic of resurrection, which could be so substantial for him, though here it's just kind of a wisp, you know. It hardly seems like something you'd stake your life on, and then, yep, that's what you do. It's Jesus slipping in or away like an airstream through air, and this smile not seen as often enough. Anyway, he did bet his life on
Great.
it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all very much. How about a few closing short comments if you have them? I'm seeing you, Judith. See if you want to say anything, or Tara and Jim, or John, or Chaz. Raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yeah. So Judith, I'll start. Yeah, go ahead, Judith. Welcome.
Hi, I wrote a poem at the day of Dan's funeral, and I'd like to read it. It's really short. New York City, Friday, May 6th, 2006, 5:35 a.m., the day of Dan Berrigan's funeral. Rain, steady on the city, tears or sustenance for the journey, for the long walk. Prepared for rain, ready for anything, we will come together, the risen bread, the few among the many, some alive because of Dan, some awake because of Dan. Rain, tears, bread. It's only us because of Dan. Thanks.
Oh, that's lovely, Judith. Thanks so much. Chaz, welcome.
John and Bill, thank you so much for this gift. And John, I loved your reading of Dan's Beatitude. And I just need to bear witness to the fact that drawing on my friendship with you, John, since third grade, you've been the most consistently human person I've ever known. And you have
Oh,
lived that beatitude. And I couldn't help, as you read it, thinking about what you have done in living your life. So thank you for all the friendship and also this fellowship today.
Oh, that's so great, Chaz. Thanks so much. And I appreciate it. And Chaz has done terrific things with his life too. Great. Thanks for being here, Chaz. Jim and Tara, were you going to give a little, or are you okay? You can unmute yourselves if you wanted to jump in. And John Fogelman, I'll call on you next.
I was just thinking, I studied, I think it was called The Study of Man, a little short book by Polanyi in college. And I remember learning about tacit knowledge and tacit learning and the things you get from a teacher that's not necessarily what they're saying. And just, I so much appreciate y'all who knew Dan passing that on to us today. So many thanks and blessings.
Oh, good. Thanks, Jim and Tara. John, do you want to add your 2 cents? John Fogelman, I'm calling on you from nearby Toronto.
Sure.
You don't have to say it.
That's okay. We began talking about both of these books, and I think they should be sold as a companion, the two volumes together. They're excellent. I don't remember the particular poem, but there's a line in one of the poems talking about McNamara's black hair. And that jumped out to me, and I could just picture him from the 60s. And thank you both for this profound afternoon together. I've appreciated each of the poems that have been read and the insights. And I also appreciated the 2 poems of hope on resurrection and the one before that you read, John. And maybe tonight we can all give a toast to Dan and to hope. Thank you both.
No, that's lovely, John. Thanks. You know what a lot of people don't know, because he refers to McNamara several times, a little Dan story. Can you imagine? Dan became very close with all the Kennedys, and every summer he'd go up, Daniel Berrigan, vacationing at Hyannisport. Before Catonsville, after Catonsville, they weren't so friendly to him. And but it wasn't as political as he thought. But anyway, he's having dinner at Bobby Kennedy's house, and the Shrivers are there, and McNamara's there. 1965, 66, the war is going on. I don't know if you know this story, John, or even you, John Yasenchuk, wherever you are.
Right.
And Sergeant Shriver says, well, okay, they just eaten dinner. We have Mr. McNamara here, who's running the war in Vietnam, and we have Father Berrigan. I think we should discuss the Vietnam War. Father Berrigan, why don't you start? And Dan goes, well, since Mr. McNamara didn't end the war this morning, I asked him to end the war this evening. That's all he said. And McNamara said, well, it's like this, Dan. It's like Mississippi. You just got to send in the troops. And Dan almost had a heart attack. The thinking, the racism, the imperialism that you could just march into another country and do whatever you want. Anyway, that was great. I see. Yeah.
That's on page 7, the death of the children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John Buck, you had a hand up, and I know we're coming to the end of our time.
Yeah, thanks again, John. Here's something pursuant to the issue of raising glasses and making toasts. I heard Dan one time describe poetry as what is left over after the business of survival has been accomplished. It's a wonderful insight into human potential, what it is to be truly human. It's what's left over after the business of survival has been attended to. Now, I note with great satisfaction and some amusement that the same can be said of the fermentation of hops and barley and other grains into what we know as spirits, a topic which Dan also appreciated and knew something about. So, a glass to Dan
That's
Berrigan.
Lovely. Maybe a good note to end on. As we come to a close, I really want to thank Bill for being here and sharing with us his book, and thank you all for being here. I just want to, in terms of Dan's books again, so The Trouble with Our State, if you haven't got it, get it or give it to friends. Bill's great book, Celebrant's Flame, from last year. If you like Dan's poetry, I did this mammoth collection, which I worked on for 10 years. It's basically Dan's collected poems, and it's still in print by Fordham University Press. I was telling Bill before we started, there's like 1,000 here. And I was reading it this morning, and there's so many. I think Bill and I are going to have to do this next year. Even if none of you come back, Bill and I are going to keep talking because the poems are so rich, but you're welcome to come back. We just had a new, smaller paperback edition done, which you can find in Barnes and Noble anywhere. It's Daniel Berrigan and the Risen Bread. If you don't know my book, Daniel Berrigan Essential Writings, it's still a kind of a great collection. Last year, I also republished, I'm publishing books by the minute here, folks. This book, Apostle of Peace, Essays in Honor of Dan Berrigan. This came out for Dan's 75th birthday, and it has 40 contributors. It's really a who's who, from Thich Nhat Hanh and Ramsey Clark to Joan Chittister and Howard Zinn and Martin Sheen, and then the famous big biography. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it, by Jim Forrest, my friend who died. I have an incredible list of Zooms coming up this summer. I hope you all saw the recent email. The next one is on Saturday, June 4th, with my friend James Finley. He was a novice under Thomas Merton for 10 years. And he's been a therapist in LA since then. He's in his 70s. And he wrote one of the greatest books of Merton, but he's considered by many the world's greatest teacher on mysticism. And he's going to talk about the mystical life of prayer and nonviolence for the first time in his life. And so I'm really excited. He normally gets, if you look up his podcasts, they normally have 500,000 people who are regular listeners. So he's a very big fish. After that, there's a whole list. I'll just read some of them quickly to you. My friend Archbishop John Wester on July 2nd, talking about the new pastoral letter, calling for nuclear disarmament. These are all my friends. July 23rd, Robert Ellsberg on the new 2-volume collection of Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker columns. Fabulous. August 6th, Hiroshima Day. Joan Halifax, who's probably the leading woman on Buddhism in the planet, on the Buddhist path of peace and nonviolence. I'll do one on August 13th on a theology of peace and nonviolence and look at the different aspects of theology from the light of nonviolence. And then I don't know if you remember, but last year, many of you were here when I had my friend, Reverend James Lawson on. Now, he was the civil rights legend. He's 93, I think, Dr. King's best friend. And we talked so much, and I said, well, we're going to do it again. So we're doing it again. Saturday, September 10th, part 2. And he's just published his first book at age 93. Wow. And it's a big fat book called Revolutionary Nonviolence. I was on the phone with him the other day. He has 5 books coming out next year, several movies, 3 biographies, and I just think that's all showing off. You've all got to come to hear the great man. He's not as famous as John Lewis, but he's John Lewis's teacher. That's Saturday, September 10th. I could go on and on. There's a whole list of them on the website. Thank you for supporting the Beatitude Center. Please tell people about it. The only way, I don't have enough money to really take out big ads and promote it. But, and so thank you for any contributions you can give. I hope you found this helpful, you all, as we honor Dan's birthday, to read some of his poems. Let me know, let Bill know if you want. Let's continue to be people of peace, to do what we can to resist this insanity of war. Notice I didn't harp on the war going on right now. I'm trying to look at the positive, deeper spirit of Dan's poetry to encourage us. And let's pray not only for the coming of an end to war, but that we could be like Dan and real holy peacemakers. So thanks very much, everybody. Thank you, Bill. And God bless one and all. Stay in touch. See you next time. I'm signing this off now. You'll get a recording on Monday. Take care. Bye-bye. Be well. No to their no, and yes to all else. Okay. God bless.